Okay guys, in this video we will discuss about relative pronouns. Relative pronouns are words that we use to introduce relative clauses. If you remember, relative clauses are some sets of clauses that provide extra information about the noun. In other words, relative clauses act as adjectives. Remember that a clause needs to have some elements to make it a clause. You need to have a subject, you need to have a verb, just like in the sentence. You need to have a subject, you need to have a verb, and you need to have a connecting word. Okay? So the relative pronouns are these connecting words between the sentence and the clause. Relative pronouns, we have very few words. We only have 5 relative pronouns. They are who, that, which, whose, and whom. That's it, only 5. Now, in the list, over there, in the list you can see on the right, you will see that there are 3 more. Where, when, and why. To be technical, these are what we call relative adverbs. Now pay attention to me. Where, let me use this, where, when, and why, just like in the case of interrogative pronouns, they act as adverbials, okay? Because they are relative adverbs. Now, relative pronouns, all of these words, they can act as subjects, they can act as objects, and they can act as adverbials. Now, to understand better relative pronouns, I have gotten some examples for you. That is the man who took your wallet. I can see the hill which you told me about. That was the time when we met. If the lockdown that the president imposed doesn't work, what will he do? I like the children whose parents are very educated. And the heat that affected the country devastated most of Goa. Now, in all of these sentences we have relative clauses. The relative clauses are underlined over there. Now, remember that I told you a relative clause provides extra information about a noun. So, in the first case, that relative clause gives me extra information about the man. It acts as an adjective. It tells me which man I am talking about. In the second example, the relative clause tells me which hill I am talking about. They act as adjectives. In the third case, the relative clause tells me which time I am talking about, and so on, okay? That is the man. Which man? The man who took your wallet. I can see the hill. Which hill? The hill which you told me about. That was the time. What time? That was the time when we met. And etc. Now, this is where it gets interesting. I need to pay attention right now. To find the function of the relative pronouns, because I bet you can identify the relative pronouns in these sentences. I mean, the clauses are underlined, and as I told you, the relative pronoun is the word that introduces the relative clause. Is the word that connects the clause with the rest of the sentence. Now, I know that who is a relative pronoun. I know that which is a relative pronoun. I know that when is a relative adverb, but let's classify it for all intents and purposes. For us, we are going to say that when is a relative pronoun, but it's not really a pronoun, okay? But we are going to classify it. Now, in order to identify them, it's not that difficult. But in order to assign the role of, let me rephrase that. But to identify what role these words are performing, then it gets a little more tricky. Gets a little trickier. Now, I advise that to identify the role that the relative pronoun is performing, you extract the clause. You take the clause from the sentence and forget about the rest of the sentence and only pay attention to the clause. Okay? So, that is the man who took your wallet. See? Who took your wallet? Do you remember that pronouns usually work with antecedents? Well, in the case of relative pronouns, we must always, and I emphasize this, always have an antecedent. So, the word who is substituting a noun in the complete sentence. That is the man who took your wallet. Who is the word? What is the word who substituting? It is substituting the man. So, in the clause, it's like if it said, the man took your wallet. If the man is the subject, what is the role for who in the clause? It's the subject, right? So, if the antecedent, the relative pronoun performs the same role that the antecedent would perform in the clause. Next one, which you told me about. What is which substituting? The hill, yes. Now, in order to rearrange this sentence, I know that which is not the subject. So, the subject is you. You told me about what? About the hill. You told me about the hill. Excuse me. The hill. Remember that the hill is being substituted by which. So, if I would place the hill at the end of the clause, you told me about the hill, I would also place which in the same position. When we met. Now, let's go back to the original sentence. That was the time when we met. So we say, we met that time. We met that time. We met when. That's the way I would reorganize this clause. That the president imposed. See? The word that is substituting what? Lockdown. The lockdown. The president imposed the lockdown. So if I moved the lockdown at the end of the sentence, I am going to also move the word that to the end. The president imposed that. Whose parents are very educated. Now, this is a peculiar case. You see, the word whose shows possession, right? So, I want to ask you, what is the antecedent for whose in the sentence? I like the children whose parents are very educated. The antecedent for whose is the children. So we would say the children's parents are very educated. Get it? That affected the country. Go back and see the original sentence. What is the antecedent for that? The heat. So you say the heat affected the country. So when you take out the he and put the relative pronoun that says that affected the country. Once we have done that, then we move and we start assigning the roles. Who took your wallet? Who is a relative pronoun acting as the subject. Which you told me about, I'm going to rearrange it. You told me about which. Which is a relative pronoun acting as the object of about. When we met, I am going to rearrange it. We met when. What is when? Well, it's a relative pronoun. Remember, it's an adverb, but we are going to say it's a relative pronoun. It's a relative pronoun acting as an adverbial. The president imposed that. The president imposed what? That. So I say that relative pronoun acting as a direct object. Whose parents are very educated? Whose? This shows possession. If it shows possession, that means that this whose is a relative pronoun acting as a genitive. That affected the country. The word that is a relative pronoun that is acting as the subject. As you can see, I recommend that when you are to identify relative pronouns, you make a transformation of the sentence. It's going to be easier for you guys to identify the role that the relative pronoun is performing. Relative pronouns are the words that introduce relative clauses. Relative clauses give extra information about nouns. So relative clauses act as adjectives. Okay? Now, also remember, the relative adverbs when, why, and where are always going to be adverbials, in that they are similar to interrogative pronouns when they are when, where, and why as interrogative pronouns. They can be interrogative pronouns, they can also be relative adverbs. Now, one last thing, do not confuse relative pronouns with interrogative pronouns. An interrogative pronoun is a question. I need the question mark. Are those questions? None of them are questions. So they are relative pronouns, okay? So you gotta be careful with that, guys. And with that, I end my explanation on relative pronouns. I hope that helps to understand this topic. And once again, you can rewatch this video as many times as you need in order to understand this better, okay? And that's all for this video, guys. See you in the next one.